The Countess of Nighttorn had faced down werewolf packs in the snow. She had outlived 3 centuries, 7 kings, and every enemy foolish enough to test her. She had never, not once in all that time, been afraid of a room full of people. But on the night, the 7 clans finally agreed to sit at one table and end a war that had drained the old world for 200 years. Ravenna of Nighttorn sat at the head of a slab of black marble and realized she could not speak a single word any of them would trust. 7 bloodlines. 7 ancient tongues, each one older than the languages mortals spoke, each one guarded like a weapon. And the only creature alive who could carry meaning between all 7 without spilling blood had just turned to ash in her east tower. That was 4 nights before the Concordat. 4 nights before the most dangerous gathering the immortal courts had ever attempted, and the Countess had no voice to speak with. So when I tell you that the thing that saved 7 nations from slaughter was not an army, not a spell, and not a 300-year-old vampire, but a mortal man the whole world had thrown away. Believe me, because the world had thrown him away twice. It was Mr. Crane who found the ash. The ghoul had served the Nighttorn household for 90 years, and in 90 years he had never once entered the Countess's chamber without scratching first at the door. So when he threw both doors open at the last gray hour before dawn, without a knock, without a word of warning, Ravenna knew before he spoke that something had gone catastrophically wrong. My lady. His voice was steady. Barely, he held a silver tray at arm's length as though it carried plague. On it sat a small heap of pale gray dust and a single blackened ring. It concerns Mortimer. Ravenna set down the cup of cooling blood she had not been drinking. Mortimer was the finest tongue-keeper in the immortal world. He spoke all 7 blood tongues without an accent, had served the courts through 4 wars, and possessed the rarest gift of all: the ability to make ancient, suspicious, murderous creatures feel they were being understood rather than merely translated. Ravenna had spent 2 years prying him loose from the northern courts for this Concordat, and now he was a ring and a handful of dust on a tray. Silver, Crane said quietly. In his cup. Slow, he would not have felt it until it was far too late. He is not dead, not fully, but he is beyond waking, not within a fortnight, perhaps not within a decade. Ravenna stood. She moved to the tall window where the first bruise of dawn was beginning to poison the sky, and she looked out over the frozen moors, and she decided in that exact moment that she would not panic. She failed. The Concordat begins in 4 nights, she said. Yes, my lady, 7 clans. The Ashbourne, the Varen, the Dracoff, the Meridian, the Hollow Court, the Sanguine, and the House of Thorns. More than 40 emissaries, most of whom would sooner tear out a throat than learn a neighbor's tongue. Yes, my lady. And the only creature who could have carried a word of peace between all 7 is a pile of dust on your tray. That is correct, my lady. The silence that followed was the particular kind that fills a room when every option has been considered, and all of them end in a river of blood. Without a tongue-keeper, there was no Concordat, no peace, and the clans would be at each other's throats before the next full moon. With Ravenna, who had held them at the table for 18 months on nothing but her name and her will, blamed for the war that followed. Send for the others, she said. Every tongue-keeper the courts still recognize. I anticipated that, my lady. Crane produced a second sheet. Of the 6 names that remain, 2 crossed the sea a month ago and cannot be reached in time. 1 was lost to a hunter's blade last winter. 1 has already been pledged to the Dracoff and cannot serve both sides, and the last 2, he paused, speak 4 tongues between them. None of them the same 4. Ravenna turned from the window. You are telling me that the oldest, richest, most powerful court in the Western world cannot produce a single creature who can speak 7 tongues in 4 nights. I am afraid that is precisely what I am telling you, my lady. And that was when Mrs. Hollow appeared in the doorway. The housekeeper was a stout, broad-shouldered woman of some 60 mortal years, one of the few living servants trusted inside the walls, who had outlasted 2 of Ravenna's stewards, 1 siege, and a fire that had gutted the West larder. She stood there, holding a fresh ewer of blood-warmed wine, as though she had simply wandered in by accident, which Ravenna knew she had not. "Forgive me, my lady," she said, pouring without being asked. "I couldn't help but overhear. The doors were closed, Mrs. Hollow." "They were not closed tightly, my lady." Ravenna almost smiled. "Almost. Speak then, Mrs. Hollow set the ewer down and folded her hands. "There's a man. Down in the border village, near the old chapel. Vane is his name, Elias Vane. Lives alone in a stone house with more books than sense, or so the village says. They call him peculiar. A gentleman with no fortune, and no wife, and no prospects, which in that village is the same as calling a man dead." She said it without apology. "But last autumn one of your emissaries sent a rider through. A Varan messenger. Half-starved. Not a word of any mortal tongue in his head. Panicked the whole village, and this Mr. Vane walked out into the lane and spoke to that messenger in the Varan's own blood tongue. Calm as anything. The messenger wept. I saw it myself, my lady. I thought nothing of it at the time." She picked the ewer back up. "I thought of it this morning." Ravenna looked at Crane. Crane looked at Ravenna. "Immortal," Ravenna said slowly. "In the border village. Yes, my lady. Who may speak one of the blood tongues." 7, my lady, said Mrs. Hollow quietly. "Or so the old blind archivist tells it. His father was a great scholar. Served the courts, they whisper. Taught the boy everything he knew before he died. The village thinks it an eccentricity, a man raising a son to speak the tongues of monsters." Ravenna was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the dawn kept climbing, and she would have to seek her chamber soon. She had more than 40 immortal emissaries arriving in 4 nights. She had no tongue-keeper. She had a war balanced on the outcome of a gathering that could not begin without one. And she had a rejected bachelor in the border village who had once made a Varan messenger weep. "Send for him," she said. Crane blinked. "My lady, the danger's alone. Immortal, inside the walls during a concordat, send for him." Tonight, Ravenna turned back to the window as the first true light broke. "And pray to whatever old gods you still remember that Mrs. Hollow's archivist is not given to exaggeration." Before Crane sent for him, there were rules, and if you're going to walk into the night-torn court, you should know them too. A vampire cannot cross a mortal's threshold uninvited. Not the countess, not the least of her emissaries. The invitation is a binding thing, older than any treaty, and it cannot be taken back with words alone. Sunlight is death, true death, ash and ending, so every window in the castle was blacked, every gathering held after dusk, and a blood oath, once sworn between an immortal and a mortal, binds them both, the vampire to protect, the mortal to serve, and neither able to break it without breaking themselves. Remember the threshold. Remember the oath. They will matter more than you know. The cottage sat at the edge of the village like something the world had forgotten to finish. Small, dark stone, ivy half swallowing a low garden wall. A wooden gate that had to be lifted before it would open. Smoke curled thin and patient from the chimney. Someone inside was already awake, though it was full dark and bitterly cold. Crane arrived in the night-torn coach, an absurd thing for a village lane, all black lacquer and silver fittings, and knocked with the expression of a servant certain he was about to regret the entire evening. Elias Vane opened the door before the second knock. He was not what Crane had pictured. On the ride over, the ghoul had assembled a comfortable image, a stooped, ink-stained recluse, wild-haired, muttering. What he found instead was a composed man of perhaps 34, with steady dark eyes and a jaw that had not been shaved by a servant, in a plain but well-kept coat, holding a worn leather-bound journal in one hand with his thumb marking the page, as though he had been reading and fully intended to return to it. He looked at the coach, then at Crane.
Then, briefly, at the crest on the door, the black thorn of Nightthorn. Nightthorn, he said. It was not a question. Her ladyship requests the honor of your company, Crane recited, at your earliest convenience. Elias considered this. Then he turned back into the dark cottage. I'll be out for the night, he called to someone within. Widow Marsh will look in on you before dawn. A thin, sharp voice answered from deeper inside. An elderly aunt, Crane would later learn, blind and frail, whom Elias had cared for these 11 years. Take your good coat, not that gray rag. Elias reappeared a moment later in a coat that was, by any honest measure, perfectly respectable. He carried the journal and a small satchel. Crane glanced at it. Books, sir? My father's journal, Elias said, and stepped past him toward the coach. Every tongue he ever learned is written in it, and every one I've learned since. The Nightthorn court announced itself long before the towers came into view. First, the black iron gates, then a mile of drive lined with dead oaks whose bare branches wove overhead into something like the ribs of a great buried thing. Elias watched it slide past the window with an expression Crane could not read. Not fear, not awe, something closer to recognition, as though he had always known such places existed and had simply been waiting for a reason to be let inside one. He was aware, the moment he crossed under the portcullis, of being watched. The two servants who took the coach let their eyes travel over his throat, his wrists, the warm, living pulse of him, with a hunger they did not bother to hide. A tall figure, who introduced himself as the Countess's seneschal, took one look at Elias and directed his next question pointedly at Crane, as though the mortal were a parcel delivered to the wrong door. Elias was used to that. He had been looked at that way in every drawing room in the county. The vain boy. Clever, they say. Odd. No fortune. Missed his chance. He wore it the way other men wore a coat. The Countess was waiting in the great library. Ravenna of Nightthorn stood beside a cold hearth in a gown the color of dried blood, holding nothing, watching him enter with a face carefully drained of everything. She was more beautiful than the stories said, and more terrible. The kind of beauty that had stopped being about attraction some 200 years ago and had become, instead, a kind of weather. Elias felt it press against his skin. He did not look away. She did not offer her hand. That would have been beneath her station. But she gestured to the chair across from her, which was more courtesy than he had received in most human houses. He sat. She remained standing. "I'll be direct with you, Mr. Vane," she said. Her English was old, precise, faintly accented by a country that no longer existed. "I have more than 40 immortal emissaries arriving in 4 nights, and no tongue-keeper. I am told you speak the blood tongues. I need to know how many and how well." Elias set the journal on his knee. "Which would you prefer first?" She blinked, just slightly. "I beg your pardon?" "The number," he said, "or the demonstration." There was no sharpness in it. It was a genuine question, and something shifted, almost imperceptibly, behind the Countess's ancient eyes. Not amusement, but adjacent to it. "Demonstrate," she said. What followed was the strangest half-hour Mr. Crane had ever witnessed. The Countess named a tongue. Elias spoke it. She produced old correspondence, brittle letters in dead hands, and he read them aloud in flawless translation, pausing to note where the original writer had blundered the grammar. The guttural war cant of the Dracov, the liquid, sorrowful speech of the Meridian, the hissing court tongue of the Sanguine, the clipped iron of the Ashbourne, the old Varan, the hollow speech, the tongue of the House of Thorns. 7. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added an eighth, a dead tongue, older than all of them, that no one had asked for and no living creature was supposed to still know. When he finished, the library was very quiet. Somewhere in the walls, the castle settled and sighed. The Countess looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Vane," she said carefully, "why does no one know about you?" Elias closed the journal. "No one thought to ask," he said. "Here's the part the village never told, the part not even Mrs. Hollow knew." 11 years ago, before his father's heart gave out, Elias Vane had once dared to want something. There had been a woman, a magistrate's daughter, above his station, but not impossibly so. And for one bright autumn he had believed he might be enough. He went to her father in his good coat, with his father's name and his own strange, useless brilliance. And he asked. The magistrate laughed, not cruelly. Worse than cruelly, comfortably, the way a man laughs at a thing that was never a real possibility. A scholar with no land, no title, and a head full of languages that will never earn him a shilling. What could you possibly give her? Elias had no answer. The woman married a wool merchant by spring, and Elias folded up that part of himself and put it away in the same drawer as his father's journal, and did not open it again. The village called him a rejected bachelor. He never argued. He had learned, young and hard, that the world had no use for him, that all those 7 impossible tongues would rot unspoken in a stone cottage, because no one on earth would ever think to ask. And now, in a library older than his country, a 300-year-old creature had looked at him and asked. Something in Elias Vane, load-bearing and long-locked, quietly began to ache. Before we go any further, this channel is brand new, and every single subscribe keeps stories like this one coming. It's free, it takes 1 second, and it means more than you know. So hit that subscribe button, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and let's step back inside the walls of Nighttorn. Because in 3 nights, the 7 clans arrive, and Elias Vane is about to learn exactly how dangerous it is to be the only warm thing in a room full of the dead. The Great Hall of Nighttorn had not been opened in 100 years. It took the whole household 3 nights to make it fit for immortals. Black candles by the 1,000, floors polished until they threw the flame back like dark water, the old Nighttorn silver laid along a table that seated 40. Every window was sealed against a dawn that would not come for hours. Elias Vane stood at the edge of it all on the night the clans arrived, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely out of place. He had worn his good coat, 7 years old, spotless by any honest measure, and announcing his mortality and his poverty as plainly as a shout in a silent church. Around him drifted creatures in silks woven before his grandfather was born, dripping with jewels dug from dead kings' graves. They moved the way still water moves. When they looked at him, they saw not a colleague, but a warm, beating thing that had somehow been let in among them. He wore the coat anyway. It was what he had. The emissaries arrived in stages. The Ashbourne came first, a stiff, iron-jawed envoy
named Kessler. The Sanguini came next, 3 in immaculate black, led by an ambassador named Auguste, who regarded charm as a tool rather than a quality. Ravenna moved through the hall like a blade through silk. She had done this for centuries. Elias moved a half-step behind her as protocol demanded, carrying words between clans, smoothing the seams between tongues, keeping his voice low enough that every conversation felt private even when it was not. Within the first hour, he caught 3 things no one else in that hall noticed. The first was a knot of old hatred between the Hollow Court and the Drakov, sparked by a single word, a rueful joke in the Drakov war cant that, rendered plainly into the hollow tongue, landed as a fresh accusation of theft. Elias saw the hollow envoy's face begin to harden into something that would demand a duel, and repositioned the sentence before it finished landing. The moment passed as though it had never happened. The second was a Meridian emissary addressing the seneschal in the Sanguine tongue under the sincere belief he was being understood. He was not. The seneschal, too proud to admit it, had been nodding along. Elias quietly filled the gap for both, and neither ever knew an entire conversation had been conducted in perfect mutual incomprehension. The third was Auguste. Elias had been watching him since he arrived. There was nothing obviously wrong. The Sanguine ambassador was polished, attentive, every inch the ancient diplomat. But during a lull, Auguste turned to Ravenna with warm concern and said, in the Sanguine court tongue, that he hoped the evening's arrangements were not proving too great a strain, given the sudden nature of the gathering, and that he particularly admired her willingness to proceed under such. And here he chose a word that, in its kindest sense, meant improvised, and in its truest sense meant desperate. Ravenna, who spoke perhaps 100 words of the Sanguine tongue and understood rather fewer, smiled graciously. Elias translated the remark into her ear as admirably arranged on short notice. He kept the surface meaning and cut the blade out of it entirely. Then he turned to Auguste and replied, on the Countess's behalf, in flawless Sanguine, that her ladyship had always believed the quality of one's guests mattered a great deal more than the length of one's preparations, and that the presence of Ambassador Auguste himself was proof enough that this concordat was already a success. Auguste blinked. He had not expected the mortal to catch it. That much was plain. He recovered smoothly, creatures like Auguste always did, and inclined his head with a small, reluctant smile that carried genuine, if grudging, respect. Ravenna leaned a fraction toward Elias under the cover of the quartet beginning a new piece. "What did you say to him just now?" "I complimented his presence, my lady. He looks like a man who has just been very politely outmaneuvered." "Does he? Perhaps the candlelight." The Countess was quiet for a moment. Then, in a tone he had not heard from her before, less the clipped efficiency of the library, something more considered, she said, "Where did you learn to do that?" Elias's hand rested on his father's journal. "My father believed a tongue without diplomacy was only noise," he said. "He taught me the difference before he taught me anything else." He did not elaborate. She did not press. It was near the end of the night that the true test came, and it nearly killed him. The Drakov and the House of Thorns had a blood feud 8 centuries deep, and it chose that hall to boil over. A Drakov captain, drunk on old wine and older grievance, rose from the table and swore, in his own war cant, that no oath sworn to a thorn was worth the breath it took, and reached for the ceremonial blade at his hip. The whole hall went still. The Thorn's envoy was already rising to answer. There was one thing that could stop it. One tongue. The oldest of the blood tongues, the 8th, the dead one Elias had spoken as an afterthought in the library, was not merely a language. It was a binding. To speak the old words of parley in that tongue was to invoke a law older than any clan, a truce no creature present could break without breaking themselves. But the tongue was not meant for mortal throats. It cut going out. Every syllable drew a price in blood. Elias did not hesitate. He stepped between the Dracoff captain and the Thorn's envoy. A warm, fragile, unarmed man between two things that could tear him in half without effort, and spoke the old words of parley. They came slow, and at a cost. By the third phrase his lip had split. By the sixth, blood ran freely from the corner of his mouth and dripped onto the polished black floor, bright and shocking in that room of pale, bloodless faces. Every immortal in the hall turned toward the smell of it. But Elias finished the parley, all of it, his voice never breaking, and when the last binding word left him, the Dracoff captain's hand came off his blade as though burned, and the Thorn's envoy sank slowly back into his seat. The feud held. The truce bound. And Elias Vane stood in the center of the hall, swaying, wiping his own blood from his chin, having stopped a war with a language that was quietly killing him to speak. Ravenna reached him before he fell. She did not care, in that moment, who saw. "You are bleeding," she said, low. "It's the price of the tongue." It always was. He almost smiled. "My father wrote in the journal that it should never be spoken unless the alternative is worse. Now I know why." Ravenna looked at the drops of red on her ancient floor, and at the mortal who had spilled them to keep her Concordat alive, and something moved behind her 300-year-old eyes that had not moved in a very long time. By the time the last emissary withdrew, the hall had settled into the particular warmth of a night that had gone well. But later, alone in the emptied hall, Ravenna stood over the small dark stain no polishing had quite lifted, and looked at the place where a rejected mortal bachelor had, without any fuss at all, changed the course of everything. She had badly underestimated him. She suspected she was not the only one who had. The immortal courts heard of it before the week was out. News traveled faster than riders among the clans, and malice faster still. By the third night, 3 versions of the Concordat's opening had passed through the shadowed salons, and every one turned on the same detail. The one that seemed to enrage certain creatures beyond reason. The tongue-keeper was mortal. A living man from a border village with no court appointment, no lineage, no immortal patron to lend him standing. A warm thing, doing the work of the dead. The salons found it fascinating. The old guard found it an insult. Silas Graves heard it in a letter. He had been, once, the finest tongue-keeper the Sanguine court possessed. 5 blood tongues, 400 years of service, and a reputation that had been the whole of his identity until a rival's translation was credited over his own, and Graves was quietly, comprehensively set aside. He had told anyone who would listen, for a century, that it had been politics, that his work had been flawless, that lesser creatures had feared his brilliance. There was just enough truth in it to make the bitterness feel earned. He had expected to be called for the night-torn Concordat. He was, by any fair measure, the most qualified creature still available. But a mortal, a village nobody, a warm, breakable man with no lineage, doing the work that had been Silas Graves's entire reason to exist, that was not an oversight. That was a wound. He began the way careful, ancient things begin, with whispers, a word in the right salon, a doubt in the right ear, that the mortal's gift was surely a trick, that a single mistranslation in a blood treaty could reignite the very war it was meant to end, that perhaps someone ought to be asking questions. By the 5th night, a small, pointed note had circulated through 3 courts, unsigned, questioning whether the countess had shown proper judgment in trusting the peace of 7 clans to a mortal of no standing. It named no one. It did not need to. The threat came to Elias directly, which was itself unusual. he found it slipped beneath the door of the small east tower chamber he'd been given. Before he slept, for he still slept, still ate, still breathed, the only warm and living thing behind those walls. The writing was neat and deliberate, in dark red ink. Or something that was not ink at all. You would be wise to return to your cottage before you are removed from these walls in a manner you will not survive. Warm things do not belong among the cold. Better to leave before the leaving is decided for you. No signature. Elias read it once, folded it, and placed it inside the back cover of his father's journal, in the pocket where his father had kept his own small collection of threats gathered over a lifetime of dangerous work among dangerous things. Then he slept, and in the morning ate a piece of bread and spent 2 hours reviewing the blood treaty. He told no one. He did not seek out Ravenna, did not question the servants, did not ask who had crossed his threshold in the night. This was not courage performing for an audience. It was quieter than that. A man who had received some version of you do not belong here his entire life, and had long since decided the only answer that mattered was to keep working. He saw no reason to let a letter in red ink stop him now. What he did not yet know was that the letter had not been a warning at all. It had been a test, to see whether the mortal would run. He had not run. And that, Silas Graves would decide, was precisely the moment to stop being subtle. Ravenna went to the village herself. She told herself it was practical, that she needed to know exactly what she had trusted her concordat to. She rode out the second night after the ball, alone, and found herself outside a small stone chapel where a very old, very blind man was sitting on a bench in the dark, as though he had been waiting. "Father Alden," she said. "Countess," he turned his ruined eyes toward her without surprise. "I wondered when you'd come. You'll want to know about the boy's father." Ravenna sat beside him, which was not a thing countesses did with village priests. Alden took it in stride. "Aldrich Vane," the old man said. "Served the courts, once yours and others. A tongue-keeper, like his son, though he never said so plainly. He traveled a great deal when Elias was small. And then, one year, he stopped, came home to that cottage, and never left again." "Why?" Alden turned a dead leaf over with the toe of his boot. "Something happened out there among your kind, some treaty gone to slaughter, some price he wasn't willing to pay again. He wasn't bitter. If anything, relieved, and he poured everything he had into the boy. Every tongue, every custom of every court. How to read what a creature means when its words say otherwise." A pause. "He used to tell me the most dangerous thing in any parley was a tongue-keeper who understood only the words." Ravenna was quiet. A crow settled on the chapel wall and watched them both. "The village thought it strange," Alden went on. "A man teaching his son the languages of monsters by candlelight. But the boy was too deep in the learning to notice. He was reading dead treaties at 12, thought they were storybooks, thought all the blood and the bargains were make-believe, until he was old enough to understand they were real, and that every one of those bargains had cost someone their life." Ravenna sat with that. A child reading the treaties of the dead by candlelight, believing they were fairy tales. "When did the father die?" 11 years past. His heart, sudden. Elias was 23. His blind aunt came the winter after, and he's given every day since to her and to those books. The village had rather less patience for the son than for the father. Alden's voice went gently, precisely cold. "A scholar with no wife and no fortune is only a curiosity to be gossiped about. Did he ever try to use what he knew? Twice he wrote to the courts when he was young, offered his service. Never got an answer. He wrote once to a mortal house of translators in the city. They wrote back that they did not employ men of his irregular education, but wished him well in his quiet country life. He said the last words with delicate contempt. Ravenna rose slowly. 11 years of that impossible education, sitting untouched in a stone cottage, serving no one, because the world had never once thought to ask whether it might be needed. She rode back to Nighthorn far more slowly than she had left it, thinking about a boy reading the treaties of monsters and believing they were stories, and about what it meant that the stories had turned out to be real, and that he had been ready for them all along. The private negotiations were held at the old hunting lodge deep in the northern woods, away from the courts, away from watching eyes. This was where the real work happened. The slow, unglamorous business of agreeing to precise terms that would hold across 7 clans, 7 laws, 7 centuries of grievance. Elias had been given a small writing desk in the corner. The emissaries had largely stopped noticing him, which suited him perfectly. Creatures say the most revealing things when they forget a warm thing is listening. It was on the 3rd night that he first noticed the phrasing. It was in the Sanctuary Clause, the section granting each clan the right to shelter within another's territory during a truce. The original draft had been clean, shelter was temporary, and required renewal every 7 years by consent of the host. But the revised version, the one that had appeared that morning, after a private late-night meeting between the Sanguine and the Drakov, used a different, older construction. It read correctly at first pass. The surface meaning seemed identical. Elias read it 3 times. Then he set it down and looked at the fire. The construction was archaic, the kind found in blood law from centuries past, in which the phrase right of shelter carried a second, buried meaning that had fallen out of common use but remained binding in the old codes. Under that reading, the clause did not grant temporary shelter subject to renewal. It granted a permanent right of entry, a standing invitation across a host's threshold that could never be revoked once given. And Elias, who had spent 4 nights being lectured on the laws of this court, knew exactly what a standing invitation meant to a vampire. It meant that whoever signed this clause would be granting rival clans the right to cross their threshold, uninvited and forever. It meant that Nighthorn's own doors, the last true protection the Countess had, would be opened permanently to the very creatures most eager to see her fall. He did not say anything. Not yet. An accusation without proof in a room full of ancient predators would start a war before he could prove it was a trap. He requested, quietly, a brief recess on the Countess's behalf, a document he needed to find. Ravenna glanced at him. He kept his face perfectly ordinary. A brief recess, she announced. A quarter hour. The lodge's small archive was dusty and long neglected. Elias moved fast, pulling old codices from the low shelves. He found what he needed in a truce 300 years old between the Sanguine and a smaller, vanished clan, the same construction. And a note in a later hand describing the disaster that followed. The smaller clan had tried to revoke the shelter, found the wording made it impossible, and within 2 generations the rival had walked freely across their thresholds and slaughtered them in their own halls. They had not survived it. Elias carried the volume back, laid it open before the seneschal, put his finger on the passage, and wrote 4 words on the corner of the man's notes, the shelter clause. Tonight, the seneschal read it. Read the codex. Read it again. His expression did not change, a credit to 1,000 years of court composure, because what he was reading was, Elias suspected, making the ancient creature feel quite ill. That night, after the emissaries withdrew, Ravenna sat with Elias and the seneschal in the lodge study while the fire burned low. Elias laid out the trap with the codex open between them. The Countess listened without interrupting. When he finished, She looked at him for a long moment. How long would anyone else have taken to find this? After it was signed? Elias closed the codex. A generation. Perhaps never. You would have simply woken one night to find your doors already open. The fire cracked. Somewhere out in the black woods, something old called once and went silent. Ravenna rewrote the clause herself, with Elias at her shoulder checking every word, while 2 corridors away the emissaries of 7 clans slept the dreamless sleep of the dead, none of them aware that their careful little trap had just been quietly, completely dismantled. In the morning, the corrected clause was presented as a routine amendment. No one objected. No one knew why it had changed. But someone in that room had been watching Elias's face during the recess. And someone understood exactly what the mortal had found. If this story has you hooked, take a second, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments how many tongues you think Elias has written in that journal of his father's by now. There's a lot more waiting for you here on Nightborn Lady. Because Silas Graves is done with whispers and hidden clauses, and the next time he comes for Elias Vane, he's going to do it in front of everyone. The last stage of the Concordat brought the courts together one final time before the signing. A great gathering in the ballroom of a dead Margrave's estate, half ceremony and half theater, attended by every clan and enough well-placed observers to guarantee that whatever happened there would be told and retold across the immortal world for 100 years. Elias noticed Silas Graves the moment he entered. The old tongue-keeper was standing near the doors, not prominent, simply present in the way a creature is present when it has arranged to be somewhere and wants the arrangement to look like chance. Silver-streaked hair, the bearing of a thing that had once mattered and had never forgiven the world for deciding it no longer did. Their eyes did not meet. Elias looked away first, not from fear, but from calculation. His father had written it in the journal, the most useful thing you can do when you sight a threat is to let it believe itself unseen. Graves made his move near the height of the evening, when the room had reached that particular pitch of noise where an announcement carries but an answer is hard. He raised his voice, not dramatically, but with the precise calibration of a creature who had planned both his words and his volume, and addressed the countess across the room. Countess, he smiled the smile of one delivering a kindness. I wonder if I might trouble you on a small professional matter. The room did not go silent. It shifted, that collective adjustment of many creatures pretending not to listen while listening with everything they had. He produced a page from the treaty draft. Even at a distance, Elias recognized it, the sanctuary clause. But the old version, the trapped one, the one that had already been quietly killed. I have taken the liberty, Graves said pleasantly, of having several passages of this treaty reviewed by scholars of the old blood law. Creatures of proper standing. A pause, weighted like a blade. There appear to be grave irregularities in the renderings your mortal has provided. Errors that, in a signed blood treaty, could cost a great many lives. Heads turned toward Elias. He was already walking. He did not hurry. Hurrying suggests alarm, and he felt none, or rather, he felt it and set it aside, which amounts to the same thing in practice. He reached the countess's side, glanced once at the page in Graves's hand, and turned to face the room. Perhaps, he said, clear enough for all of them to hear, you might name the specific passage your scholars found irregular. It would help to answer it precisely. Graves had not expected the mortal to invite the scrutiny. He recovered. The third subclause. The rendering of the old sanguine construction. Elias recited it from memory, the original and flawless old sanguine, then his English rendering, then the second possible reading, and then, without pausing, the exact reason that second reading was a legal trap under the old blood codes, citing by name the 300-year-old treaty and the clan that had been slaughtered by precisely that wording. The room was very quiet now. The sanguine ambassador Auguste, of all creatures, set down his glass. "Mr. Vane's rendering is correct," he said into the silence, in careful English so the whole room would understand. "And his grasp of the buried construction is, in my long experience, exceptional. He caught what my own scholars did not." He looked at Graves without warmth. "One wonders where the irregularity truly originated. And who supplied you that discarded page?" An Ashbourne elder added, dry as bone, that the mortal had corrected one of her envoy's errors 2 nights prior and spared them a formal blunder in the record. Elias said nothing. He did not need to. The evening simply flowed on around Silas Graves like a river around an inconveniently placed stone. Graves did not leave at once. That would have looked like retreat. But he had the face of a creature who had walked into a room expecting one kind of night and was now recalculating everything. It happened as the gathering thinned. A Dracov hardliner, sour that the trap he'd helped bury had been exposed, stepped into Elias's path in a shadowed corridor and said, lo, that it was a strange age indeed when the peace of 7 clans hung on the word of a warm thing, and that warm things were so very easily silenced. He let his hand drift toward Elias's throat. He never reached it. Ravenna was between them before the hand had risen an inch, and she did not raise her voice, and that was somehow worse than if she had. "This man is under my blood," she said. The corridor went still. Every creature there knew the weight of the phrase. To place a mortal under one's blood was to swear a binding oath before witnesses, to pledge one's own existence to his protection, and to make any harm done to him a blood debt owed by the whole of one's line. It was not a thing a countess did for a servant. Not lightly, not often, not ever. She had done it in front of everyone. For a mortal. For a rejected bachelor from a border village. The Drakov's hand came down. He bowed, stiffly, and withdrew. Elias looked at her. "You didn't have to do that, I am aware." She did not look at him. "It is done regardless." Later, on a balcony where the cold couldn't touch her and the night air stung his living skin, they stood without speaking for a while. "You'll grow old," Ravenna said finally. Quietly, not unkind, simply true. "In 40 years, 50, you'll be gone, and I will be exactly as I am tonight. You know what I am. You know what I could offer to change that." Elias watched his own breath fog and vanish. He knew the question that lived underneath the words. The embrace, the crossing over, the end of warmth, and the beginning of forever. "My father wrote something about the old creatures who ask that," he said. "He said the ones worth serving never ask it to keep you. Only to spare you." A pause. "You haven't asked." "No," she said. "I haven't." Neither of them said anything more. Some questions are better left standing in the air where both people can see them and choose, later, whether to reach for them. The signing was set for the coastal keep at Dover, a cold, salt-bitten place beneath white cliffs, where 3 black ships waited at anchor to carry the emissaries home across the water. The blood treaty would be sealed at midnight in the keep's great hall, with the ancient wax and the 7 clan seals and the heavy folios of the final agreed text. Elias had not slept. Something had been wrong since the ballroom, a wrongness he couldn't name. Graves had gone too quiet, and silence from a creature like that was worse than any noise. He rose before the others and asked the seneschal to see the folio one last time. He read the sanctuary clause. Intact, the corrected wording, the one he and Ravenna had written by the lodge fire. He turned the page. Something stopped him. It was the seal, the wax impression at the foot of the signature page. It was wrong, not by much, not enough for any casual eye. But Elias had handled these documents for 2 weeks, and he knew the particular press of the Nightthorn seal, the small worn flaw on the left edge of the thorn. This impression was clean. Too clean. And beneath it, the blood seal, the drop of a signatory's own blood pressed into the wax, readable by any vampire as surely as a face. Did not sing with Nightorn's line. It was empty. A dead thing's blood. A forgery. He turned to the Countess's preliminary mark. The ink was right, the letters close, but the way the great thorn sigil curled at its base was subtly, fatally wrong. He had watched her sign 6 documents. He knew her hand better than his own. He stood. Where did this folio come from tonight? The sealed courier pouch, the seneschal said. From the strong room at midnight's turn. Who held the strong room last? A pause. Something shifting in the ancient face. The night warden. But there was an incident. He was found ashed near dawn. A replacement was sent. I do not know by whom. Elias was already moving. He found Ravenna in the upper corridor and told her in under a minute the seal, the blood, the hand, the warden. She listened without interrupting. The true folio, she said. Still in the pouch, beneath the false one. They'd have pulled the real one before it reached the table, Elias said, and sealed the trapped clause into a blood treaty 7 clans would be bound to keep. Permanent entry to your thresholds. Written in blood. Impossible to undo. Ravenna's eyes went very old and very cold. No one touches those folios until I have seen everything. What followed was not elegant. It involved the seneschal, 2 clan wardens pressed into service as witnesses, 3 increasingly alarmed servants, and a locked room where the pouch was cut open before 4 sets of eyes. The forged folio was there, exactly as Elias had said. Beneath it, the true one, untouched, and sewn badly into the lining, in thread that did not match, a single instruction in a neat and educated hand, describing precisely how the documents were to be switched, and when. It was signed with 2 initials only. S.G. Silas Graves was found at the water's edge, attempting to buy passage on a private ship across the channel. He was not permitted to board. The blood treaty was sealed at midnight, on schedule, with the true documents and the true seals, all 7 clans present. The old wax cooling around 7 drops of living blood. Outside, the channel wind kept up its endless argument with the cliffs, indifferent as ever to the affairs of the dead and the living both. But Elias Vane stood at the keep's window and watched the black ships make ready to sail, and felt the quiet, specific satisfaction of a man who had caught the tide before it turned. The Concordat held. 7 clans, 3 great accords, 1 truce meant to last 100 years, sealed without a single throat torn, without a single war rekindled. The courts called it the most quietly significant peace in 3 centuries. 2 elders who had privately backed Graves's whispers suddenly discovered they had always admired the Countess's unconventional judgment. Ravenna found this predictable and mildly amusing, which was how she found most things. She brought Elias back to Nightorn under the pretense of reviewing the final text, loose ends, a meridian addendum, a phrase rendered 3 different ways. It was true enough to be a reason, if not the true one. They worked through the legitimate business. Then, when it was cleared away and the great library had resumed its ancient quiet, Ravenna set down the page she was holding and looked at him directly. I intend to create a position, she said. Tongue-keeper to the House of Nighthorn. A true appointment, a seat at the court, a standing among the clans, full acknowledgement in every accord. There will be more concordats, more treaties, more nights the peace turns on a single word. She paused. I want that seat to be yours. Elias was quiet a moment. You don't have to do that. A letter would serve. A reference. I could find work with it. You could, she agreed. Eventually, after enough letters, to enough creatures, who would take enough centuries to overcome their reservations about a mortal of no lineage. She said it plainly. Or you could hold a seat that requires none of that, one that exists because you earned it, and because the peace is safer with you keeping it. They'll say you made it out of obligation, he said, for the man who caught the forgery. They'll say whatever lets them sleep. They said you were a rejected bachelor with no business among the dead. Something moved behind her eyes. They were wrong about that too, and something in Elias' vein. The part that had been load-bearing and locked for 11 long years was quietly informed that it no longer had to hold quite so much weight. Yes, he said. I'll take it. The court gathered in the depth of winter to mark it, several of the emissaries who had stayed, a scattering of the old guard who had spent the autumn calling Elias the warm thing and were now managing the adjustment with varying grace. Ravenna made a short speech. She credited the piece to careful preparation, to sound counsel, and to the exceptional work of her newly named tongue-keeper, Elias Vane, without whom the Concordat would not have held. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Afterward, when the hall had emptied, Elias stood at the tall black window where the sealed glass had been opened just a crack against the safe dark of deep night, and looked out over the frozen moors under a thin and distant moon. Ravenna came to stand beside him, not the countess and her servant, not patron and appointment. Two people who had, over one long and dangerous autumn, arrived at the particular kind of regard that needs no name, because both of them already understood what it was. Your father would have found all of this deeply satisfying, she said quietly. Elias looked out at the moors a moment longer. His hand rested, as it always did, on the worn leather journal, his father's tongues and all his own, and now one more page begun that very morning, the first entry of a new keeper of a new court. He'd have said it was about time, Elias murmured. And for the first time since any of this began, he smiled properly. Not the careful, professional expression he'd worn through receptions and parleys and public attacks. A real one. Unhurried, unguarded, the moonlight held for another few minutes before the winter let it go. And that, quietly and without ceremony, was how the world's most unwanted man became the most important voice in the courts of the dead. If you're still with us, you're part of this story now. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments which journal entry hit you hardest. The tongue that cost him blood, the night she swore him under her own, or the very last page he began at Nighttorn. There's so much more waiting for you here on Nightborn Lady. Stay in the dark with us. End.